everyone. Welcome to this series of talk we are organizing on illustrious scientists at the pre-independence era as a part of this Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, which is on the 75th year of celebration of independent India. And today is the second talk of this series, where the talk will be given by our governing body chairman, Professor P.N. Jagtap, and he is going to talk about another. Last time we heard about Professor Satyendranath Bose, the life and work of Professor Satyendranath Bose. In today's talk, he is going to cover the life and work of Professor Sir Acharya Prafulla Chandra Ray, who is another very illustrious person. And other than being scientist, he was a great educationist. He was a great industrialist. I mean, which actually has been one of the motto of Make in India. So he was already far-sighted to think about it. And he basically was considered as the father of the chemical science research in India. And he was also the father figure of the Bengal chemicals, the industry that he developed, which is the research connected to industry. Not only that, I think maybe some of you know, he was also a great social activist. In fact, in Bengal, the north of Bengal was flooded, and he came up with this idea of Bengal Relief Fund, where he went from various doors to door to collect money. So the scientist also has a social responsibility, and this great man actually taught us about that. He generously funded to many of the organizations, the Brahmo Society, the Brahmo Girls College. He was very much proactive with the girls' education and their upliftment, which is also some issue which has been got a lot of attention in these days. So with that, I welcome today's speaker for the talk, and we are going to hear more from Professor Jagtap about the life and work of this great man. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sahadas Gupta. It's indeed a privilege to discuss a defining personality of the pre-independence time, Professor B.C. Ray, in an institute which is named after another great of pre-independence day, Professor S.N. Bose. I do understand that speaking on Professor B.C. Ray in Kolkata is going to be a demanding task. Every one of you who is born and brought up in Calcutta knows about him, right from your formative days, the schools and even today. And therefore, I thought of giving a different perspective about life and work of Professor Ray. And that perspective is as follows. Friends, when we are celebrating this Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, there are several things happening around us. There is a call for Atmanirbhar Bharat. The new national education policy has been implemented. It's 1 year from its implementation. There is also the corona pandemic, which has taken toll of our physical as well as mental health. Now, on this backdrop, can we revisit Professor P.C. Ray's thought and try to find out some answers to the things which we are surrounded by? That's the perspective which I'm going to present. And this perspective is as per the definition and objective of history. It says, the history is the study of the present in the light of the past. If we study history like this, then we can definitely make a statement whether we have progressed or we have not progressed. What is the stage of our progress? So let me begin this presentation. So this is a brief CV of Professor Ray. Well, this is not going to be important for us. We know all about it. He obtained his Gilchrist Scholarship for Higher Studies at University of Edinburgh in 1882. The interesting point about this Gilchrist Scholarship was the applicant should know 4 languages. And Professor Ray knew English, Sanskrit, Latin, and French. So therefore, he qualified for it. So he was a linguist on his own right. We'll discuss some part of that at a later stage. Got his BSc in chemistry in 1885, BSc in 1887. Joined Presidency College, and he was with the Presidency College until 1916. Then he joined Calcutta University as Palek Professor, and from 1937 to 1944, he was Emeritus Professor at overall 158 research papers. Incidentally, this year also marks the 160th birthday of Professor Ray. Well, as Professor Sahadas Gupta said, well, P.C. Ray was a scientist, educationist, humanist, philanthropist, rationalist, and patriot all par excellence. And another great of that time, Jagdish Chandra Bose, another Acharya, what he said about him was the combination of such qualities in a single individual is indeed rare. There can be no higher example for younger generation to emulate. And this is true even today. Now, the work of Acharya Praful Chandra Ray, if I may put it in just one slide. The first one is the chemical discoveries, the original investigation, by right of which he took his recognized place among chemists. The second one was his work on Hindu chemistry, which made known to the world the science of ancient India. Establishment of Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceutical Works as a successful industrial enterprise. Then he trained a band of young chemists, for which he is known as the father of modern chemistry in India. And what he himself calls as life and work outside the test tube, which has got nothing to do with the chemistry, and that is his contribution to the social activities as well as the freedom movement. Now let me put few things around these 5 themes and discuss it. The first, let's discuss the chemistry research. And in many instances, you'll find in this presentation, I have not left it to my own interpretation. And therefore, what I have done is I have brought his own words when it comes to specific issues. Now, his first research in India, I enjoyed this particular commentary. His first research in India was published in Journal of Asiatic Society of Bengal, 1894, and the title of the paper was Chemical Examination of Contaminants in Foodstuff Part 1, The Fats and Oils. It's very interesting that at that time, he wanted to know the contaminants in ghee and the mustard oil that was sold in Calcutta. And any chemist who works on contaminants and all that, he knows that to do it fairly and honestly, you need a standard reference material. For these two materials, the fats and oil, there was no standard material, standard reference material, and therefore Professor Ray goes on to prepare his own standards for these materials. And what he says about it is pretty interesting. And I read it out. It is, however, by no means an easy task to detect by chemical analysis the adulterants used and their percentage. The composition of Indian ghee is different from that of a British cow, and hence the analysis of later, as published in English work of foods, cannot be relied upon. See, mark the words, and we shall discuss that little later. I procured samples of these articles from most reliable sources and also had them prepared under my personal supervision. The work undertaken thus involved stupendous labor, and I was busy with it for nearly 3 years. The one piece of work took 3 years for him. Now today, we understand this in more clear terms. Today we use the terminology called certified reference materials. Anything that you want to test, it has to be tested against certified reference materials. And today, if the figures are right, India imports certified reference materials for 10,000 crores every year. Something which Professor P.C. Ray started in 1894. And I can say that, well, preparing this certified reference material is a stupendous labor. I personally was involved in preparing this first Indian reference material for gold and then quartz. I know that takes about 2 years, even using the modern instrumentation. So where are we lacking? The issue is that the industry requires certified reference materials. We do not produce them in this country. 10,000 crores is a huge number. NIST, that is United States, they have something like 3,000, 4,000 certified reference materials with them. We claim only about 100. If you want to know the pollution in your cities, you definitely do the measurements, but then if someone asks you the question, how did you calibrate your measurement instrument? Well, the calibration requires certified reference material. So whatever data you have is worth nothing. You can also remember that about 5 years, 6 years ago, there was a case of lead in noodle. And the case did not stand because if you ask people, how did you measure lead in noodle? What certified reference material did you use? There was no answer. Legally, none of these things stand in the court of law. None of these things stand in the commercial world. The industry requires metals which have got less than 1 ppm of hydrogen, dissolved hydrogen. Where are those certified reference materials in this country? And this is what is the big lesson that we need to take, that for anything, it's the commercial activities, the legal activities related to the materials, you require these certified reference materials, and this is what we need to produce in big numbers. Well, let me also go through some of the illustrious scientific work that he carried on. But this I will not spend much time. All of you know about it. The first one is mercurous nitride and related compound. It is well known to the chemistry students that the mercurous is an unstable species, undergoes disproportionation in solution. And nitrite is also another unstable species. And a combination of two unstable species to create a stable species is this work, that mercurous nitride. The reactions are shown below, and you can see that here we produce a series of these alkyl, aryl, ammonium nitrides, and so on and so forth. And in the same line, the hyponitrites, another unstable species, and he showed the way how to produce this using simple nitric acid and using sodium hyponitrite. Another part of his work was on organic sulfur compounds, and to his credit, is the first synthesis of crystalline organic sulfur compounds with high molecular weights. And you can see the reaction, which is 1,2-dithione reacting with ethylene bromide, and that produces a compound like this, which is over 3,000 molecular weight. Also, these condensed heterocyclic compounds, this triethylene trisulfide, triethylene tetrasulfide, and also you can oxidize them to produce these sulfone compounds. That's another interesting piece of work that he did. And also the coordination compounds, the coordination chemistry of platinum, iridium, gold with the organic sulfides as ligands. Some of these things are part of the textbook today. However, let me make a mention. He observes in case of iridium, two isomers, red and orange, and the orange isomer is the first reported compound of the type MX3R2S3 and provides a rich chemistry for trivalent cations like iridium, rhodium, osmium, ruthenium, and so on and so forth. And the red isotope, red isomer, which was produced in this reaction, has a structure something like this. Well, Goswami and Bhattacharya have reviewed this, his chemical activities, issue of resonance, and the younger generation should look into this particular. Now let me spend some time on his activities as an educationist. And there are very interesting things which he writes. And I thought that I'll bring it to the notice of the faculty members and the students, his ideas about education. The first one, this I was very fascinated with, was introducing science to children. How do we do that? Now the National Education Policy also talks about the ways to introduce science, develop the critical thinking. What was Professor B.C. Ray's ideas those days? And I'll bring his words ditto. He writes, shortly after I began my duties as Presidency College, my mind was troubled over the poverty of Bengali literature on scientific side. This was in 1880, and we need to ask this question. Now, instead of Bengali, we should use all Indian languages. Are we still poor in terms of literature on scientific side in our regional languages? The answer is still yes. And then what does he do? I seriously entertained the idea of writing books on primers on chemistry, botany, and zoology. I naturally took to chemistry, but gave it up. His field of expertise was chemistry, but he did not want to write books on chemistry. And then he says, nature study seems to offer better attraction to the juvenile minds, and the animals and vegetables kingdoms afford almost unlimited scope in this direction. The whole world of Bengal, and write it as in India, is nature's laboratory. One of the main objects of teaching elementary science to children of tender age is to bring out their latent powers of observation, and the lessons conveyed through the life history of a plant animal are admirably calculated to serve this purpose. How you can naturally invoke the curiosity and critical. This is not by implanting stories about something which the students cannot connect with. I often give an example on this. Once I was talking to a group of students, Inspire workshop. And purposely, I had taken a topic, Make in India, that is to sensitize the students. So at the end of the lecture, I said, well, if you have questions, you can please ask. That hall had about 700 students. And there were two lines. On the left side were the boys, and on the right side were the girl students. The huge lines. I said, well, my lecture really inspired these students. So I turned to the boys' side and said, what is your question? The first question that I get is, sir, you have not talked about black holes. Then I guessed it. Then I asked the second fellow, what is your question? Sir, if universe is expanding, what are the limits of its expansion? Then I guessed that they have all kinds of questions like this in their mind. So I said, well, although I am not expert in these areas, I can certainly entertain some of these questions, give you some elementary ideas. However, I have one question in my mind. If you answer my question, then I'll answer your question. And my question was too simple. In that hall, there were the old type tube lights. So I asked them, look, every one of these tube lights has a starter and a choke. Can you tell me what is the role of choke and what is the role of starter? All the students were worrying about the universe, and the black holes did not know this. So I said, fine, you find out the answer and I'll let you know later. Turn to the next, the girl's side. What is your problem? Your question. The girl said, well, there are chlorofluorocarbons. I said, yes, there are chlorofluorocarbons. Why are you troubled about it? Sir, they create the ozone hole, and ozone hole gives rise to skin cancer. I said, yes, very well. But do you know where is this ozone hole formed? But the girl has no idea. Then I posed a counter question and said that, look, I am near the equator. The amount of ultraviolet rays I am getting on my skin will be certainly of the same order as what is seen through the ozone hole. I do not get skin cancer because there is a pigment in my skin. So let me not worry about it. But do you know, just about 1 kilometer from your college, there is River Ganga, and along the Gangetic belt, the number of cancer cases of intestine and stomach are about 60% higher than the National Cancer Registry. Do you know about this? Well, the student does not know about it. And that is where I made a statement. Professor P.C. Ray's things were at the back of my mind. I said the science is not beyond you. Don't think that the science is in United States, in Canada, and in Europe. Science is not only on Mars or Venus or Moon. Science is around you. Let's try to understand this. It is the same science. And that is what we need to appreciate first. And this is the first lesson that we need to. We should not be giving age inappropriate ideas of science to the younger generation. And this is what is the lesson, what we learn from what Professor Ray has written in How to Introduce Science to Children. In 1889, he writes all his observations are in his autobiography. What he writes is, to be a successful teacher, especially of junior students who are commencing a course in elementary chemistry, it is essential that he should have a neat hand in conducting experiments. And this should be so arranged to make the lecture not only interesting, but intelligent. This is particularly reflected in the national education policy. Now then he says, an appointment is often made on the strength of academic qualification. A candidate may have done admirable research work, but I have often noticed miserable failures from such selections. You have to watch it out. It should be sine qua non for a lecturer that he should have gone a thorough probationary stage as a class assistant. Don't introduce a fresh teacher to the class but he should undergo 1 year probation. And this is an important idea that we need to also consider. Well, he was very critical of the university education, and therefore we need to also introspect today. What he said, it is enough to mention that the market value of an average graduate does not exceed is 25 per month. Well, you can replace these figures, it is 25,000, 25 rupees per month. You can say it is 15,000 or 20,000 rupees per month. And then he says barely 1% of them is successful in life in the worldly sense, while thousands rush to their doom thoughtlessly. Now, we need to think about this statement very carefully. It is necessary that the attention of the country should be clearly drawn to the colossal waste of energy and national intelligence in the past by our scheme of university education. And I leave it to the faculty and the students to discuss this particular issue. And therefore, at the end, what he writes is, I do not hesitate to say that degree only serves as a cloak to hide degree holders' ignorance. He knows little, cares to know less beyond the irreducible minimum required for passing the examination. This was the situation in 1890, and today also we have the same situation. And from these statements and from the experience that we have today, it appears that the education sector is frozen for about 130 years. I mean, this is what we need to think. Is that not right that the present education system, the way it has come to us through the British Education, English Education Act and the University Acts of 7 and 1904, are they not, can they not be described as a waste of energy and the national intelligence? And this is where we need to really move over. Then he writes on the university degree holders. About this time, that was 1891 to 92, another matter began to seriously occupy my thoughts. The moment our students come out of their college, look out for a soft job under the government or in European mercantile form. The things have not changed today. They'll still look for soft job under government or in a multinational company. That is what you can replace now, that European mercantile form. The college educated Bengali, now he's writing about the Bengali youth, replace it by Indian youth, could reproduce from memory notable passages from Shakespeare and Milton and quote ad nauseam, Mill and Spencer, and all the same would helplessly fail in the struggle of life. This is exactly what we see today, that we are educating our students only for a more education. The aim of primary education is to prepare a student for a secondary education. The aim of secondary education is to prepare a student for college education. And aim of college education is to prepare a student for university education, for PhD or something like that. At no time we prepare our students to deal with life. This existed in 1891, and even today we have the same issue. And then he gives one interesting anecdote. The student taking MA degree in chemistry usually attended law lectures. And then he asked a student, why are you doing chemistry, MA in chemistry and law degree together? And that student replied, sir, if I can have the MA degree, then I shall have the letters MABL, BA is for Bachelor of Law, suffixed to my name, and my claim to membership will be stronger thereby. So adding these qualifications is a norm ever since 1890, that's what we can say. And this is where I will reflect on a wonderful book, The Rise of Robots. There is a very interesting story which is given, and I'll put it in my words. Education is a ladder. It's a ladder for higher career opportunities. However, one should realize that this ladder is not in free space. This ladder is in a pyramid. So as you go up, the space shrinks, and there are already more people crowded there. So you still climb one step more, then the space will shrink further, and more people will be competing for that. So what ultimately happens to a person, then he climbs 3 steps down and accepts the job at that configuration. This phenomena has been happening in the country for after independence. We have seen this is happening. The reason for this is this particular thing which is got into the student's mind, that if I get a degree, while the degree is a cloak to hide one's ignorance, one would say that my chances of getting a job, a better job. What is required is not this. What is required is something else. And that something else is to develop skills along with your degree so that you can face the world, the real world, and we shall see something about it at a later stage. Now we also talked about the importance of mother tongue. And this is an issue which has been debated over the years and particularly in last 2 years. So I have brought to you some part of his convocation address given at Mysore University in 1996. And what he says is, if we begin by critically examining our methods in India, the first outrage that we find we committed was to make a foreign language our vehicle of instruction. It is surprising that the principal reason for our intellectual sterility was not discovered till very recently, and this is still more surprising to find that some of our well-known educationists even today continue to regard the relegation of the English language to an inferior position as fraught with disastrous consequences. To avoid misconception, and this warning is extremely important in today's time, to avoid misconception, I must here once for all make it clear that the study of English or any other important foreign language is by no means discouraged. They open up new vistas of thought and ideas. And then he concludes, a man of education must in the first place be one well up in all-round information, and he can gather it best and in the minimum time if he does so in language he learned to slip in while sucking his mother's breast, the language of his nursery. Arithmetic, history, economics, politics, logic, geography. In the short, the book of knowledge can be readily be mastered in one's own vernacular. That should be the first stone in our education edifice if we want to build well and high. And this importance of the mother tongue now we find also reflected in the national education policy. So you can see someone who thinks about very broadly about the education 1890, 1895 is still true in this country 2020. Professor Ray was an academic entrepreneur, first academic entrepreneur of the country, and his vision for India was progress of India and Indians can only be possible through education and economic prosperity of the masses. And for later, that is for the economic prosperity, the commerce and industry are essential, and that chemistry can play a major role for countries' industrial and economic progress. Well, that time the chemical industry was at the high end, and therefore he writes chemistry. Today we have to replace that word chemistry by physics, biology, or anything. And remember in 1890, 1895, where people were talking about education as the sole objective, there was a man who thought about producing the economic prosperity through commerce and industry. And that economic prosperity through commerce and industry can be brought by through the study of the basic sciences, the chemistry at that time. And therefore he founded, we all know, the Bengal Chemical and Pharmaceutical Works in 1892. He was also associated with several other commercial ventures like the Bengal Potteries, Bengal Enamel, National Tanneries, Weighing Machine, Manufacturing Company, Indian Shipping Company, the Scindia Shipping Company, publishing houses, so on and so forth. So this was the era where the intellectuals were not only looking for education as a thing to drive the country to the future, but also that we need to develop the industry, and that is how to create the economic prosperity. Around a little earlier than P.C. Ray, there was a person in Maharashtra called Jyotiba Phule. He was an educationist. He opened schools. At the same time, he was commissioner of Pune Municipal Corporation. He also had publishing houses. He had a contracting company, the engineering company. Some of the ghats, old ghats in Maharashtra, they were built by his company. And the Municipal Corporation of Mumbai, that building, was built by one of his partners. So there were people who were not looking at education as the sole motive, sole objective. But in order to build this India, we need to do all this, the economic activities, and therefore these things are going to be important. And in this light, P.C. Ray stands out, and we shall talk about little more about this. Now, this is said that he founded Bengal Chemical and Pharmaceutical Works. And if we just give this message to the students, they will not understand much about it. And therefore, what was the struggle he went through while he was working on this idea of Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals? I must bring it to you. So this is on the birth of Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals, and how a person works from different parts and comes up with a successful business. And this is what should be a training to our MBA students today. Now, what he writes is, in Europe, industry and scientific pursuits have gone hand in hand. Both have advanced pari passu. Oh, his expertise in, you can see it here, pari passu, the one helping the other. I began a thorough examination of Calcutta drugstores and made inquiries of the imports as to the quantities in which the British pharmacopoeia medicines are imported. The first one is the market survey. That is what we need to do. You cannot produce something which has no demand in the market, no demand in the society. The first thing to do is the market survey. Being a chemist, says, okay, let me go to the drugstores and make an inquiries about the imported pharmaceuticals and chemicals. I had read in my textbook that the sulfuric acid mother of all other industries. When I began my preliminary trials, I had no previous experience, and this is you need to prepare sulfuric acid as the starting material without previous experience of large-scale manufacture, and that's true with every youngster today. I visited works in Calcutta, the sulfuric acid works. The primitive and wasteful methods of manufacturing of all these acids made me almost sick. How many of us visit the industry and make the statement, well, this process could have been improved a bit more, well, this machinery could have been developed a little bit more to have more efficiency. Our education system isolates us from the happenings around us. That connectivity is basically hard, and this is where he starts developing that connectivity. And he finds that whatever is happening is making him sick. This needs improvement. Having selected the problem of locally manufacturing on large scale, some of the chemicals which hitherto used to be imported, I took preparation of some chemicals to start with, syrup very iodide, liquor arsenical, liquor bismuth, spiritrus erythris nitrosi, and potash nitrous, and later added preparation of Ayurvedic medicine. So identifies this is what one is going to produce. Now you see this is extremely important. Being a chemist, he can produce those chemicals. He can scale up. However, he requires containers. So where does he get the containers? Then he writes, second-hand bottles and glazed jars, the empties, could be procured in any number from Bikriwalas of Bow Bazaar Street. So begin with this. So you get those bottles from Bhangarwala, that is what is called in Hindi, and of course clean them and use them. So he sorted out the second problem. Now, then he visits the chemist shop that, see, look, I have these chemicals produced indigenously. What is the response that he gets? And this is the same response that he will get today. Bilati, this is the imported drugs from the firms of established reputation, command the ready sale. Whereas they see the indigenous drugs would be refused by our customers. The same thing will happen today. But then you need to fight it out. Now, you have done the market survey, you have produced the material, you have somehow bottled it, and now the next is you got to market it. How do you market it? Now, this is an excellent trick that he uses. The Indian Medical Congress was held in Calcutta in 1898, where an exhibition of the preparation of pharmaceuticals was organized. So what he does is he demonstrates the formulations made by him. These are the Indian ones, these are the local ones. And then this Indian Medical Congress, they gave a strong representation to officially recognize the medicines prepared by Professor Ray. So the strong representation was made by the Council of the Congress, urging the official recognition of some of these drugs, and the British pharmacopoeia authorities were at last prevailed upon to find the backseat for them in the addendum. They did not add in the main pages, but they were added in the addendum. And from here, there was no looking back for Bengal chemicals and pharmaceuticals. This is that our younger generation need to know that doing a startup is not going to be very simple. You need to go through the stages, survey the market, produce your material, produce it at a cost, find out all the things, and also find out avenues how you can market it. Now, there was a report in the review of the industrial position and prospects in Bengal, a report of 1908, about 10 years after the birth of Bengal Pharmaceutical Works. And what he says is, the Bengal Chemical and Pharmaceutical Works is one of the most go-ahead young enterprise in Bengal. Dr. P.C. Ray started it as a small private concern about 15 years ago and made drugs from indigenous materials. About 6 years ago, it was made into a limited liability company with a capital of 2 lakhs. Many of the chemists in Calcutta are shareholders of this company. That's an important masterstroke. The people who are going to sell your product, he made them as the shareholders of the company. It has now a well thought out and well managed factory with about 70 workmen. The variety of manufacture of laboratory apparatus which requires skilled craftsmen in wood and metal has been taken up. So now the plans for expansion that we should produce the laboratory apparatus and also go for the perfumes. So that's kind of entrepreneurial spirit that Professor Ray had. This is needed in today's time. Another interesting part of his association with Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceutical Works was he remained associated with it until 1939, and he resigned in 1939 from the board. And he was requested to withdraw his resignation, and then he writes, "My joining the board is out of question, especially in view of their attitude towards the research work." See, to grow your company, You cannot be just doing it something which was done in 1808, 1939. You need to do continuously, do the research, upgrade, add new products. I am glad that I can wash my hands clean of all responsibilities in the matter of failure of the market. The fixed running idea of yours and the directors had always been to squeeze out everything as long as they could offer large dividends. You're not spending money for doing research, but only looking at the profit, and therefore the truthful person that he is. Time. Well, Professor B.C. Ray's attempts in British, the Bengal chemicals and pharmaceutical work inspired several people. And two academicians I should name here. One is Risharam Sani, who was a professor of physics and chemistry at Government College, Lahore. In 1914, he established sulfuric acid factory at Lahore. And another one was from Mumbai, Tribhuvan Das Kalyan Das Gurjar. He was in constant touch with Professor Ray, the professor of chemistry in the Wilson College, Mumbai. He started a small chemical factory in 1903, and in 1907, he started Alembic Chemical Works at Baroda. This was under the patronage of Maharaja of Baroda, and this chemical factory, the chemical works, still exists. So you can see the academicians entering into the business. In fact, in case of Gujar, he partnered with his student, Professor Kote Bhaskar, and took one businessman, Bidi Amin, as a partner. And these three people together, they established this. Let me spend little time on his life and work outside the test tube. Well, in 1901, he came in contact with Gopal Krishna Gokhale and Mahatma Gandhi. In fact, 1901, Mahatma Gandhi visited Calcutta. And 1921 onwards, he spread the message of Khadi and national education. Well, he had the industrialist mindset. However, he also promoted charkha. And the reason he said, when he was asked this question that you are a man of industry, why are you interested in charkha? He said charkha is a poor man's insurance against fainting. Mark his words. In 1921-26, he traveled throughout the country to promote Khadi national education and removing untouchability. Had an active participation in freedom struggle, and as Professor Sardas said, he organized the relief operations in the Khulna famine 1921 and North Bengal floods 1920. This is a part of what Mahatma Gandhi wrote about Professor P.C. Ray. I had the privilege of knowing Sir P.C. Ray for the first time when Gokhale was his next door neighbor in 1901, and I was undergoing tutelage under the late, that was the Guru Shishya Gokhale Gandhi relationship. It was difficult to believe that the man in simple Indian dress and wearing simple manners could possibly be the great scientist and professor he one then was. And it took my breath away when I heard that out of his princely salary, he kept only a few rupees for himself.
Sir, you are mute.
Yeah, Samir, not only mute, video has frozen, so just you have to wait. The connection is gone from the boardroom.
Okay,
Okay,
so am I
okay.
audible now?
Understood.
The protest against the Rowlatt Act, this was passed in 1990. As you know, there are several incidences associated with the protest against the Rowlatt Act. We know about Jallianwala Bagh incidents. This Rowlatt Act gave draconian powers to the government to arrest people who are supposedly anti-national at that time. And Chittaranjan Das organized a protest against the Rowlatt Act in Calcutta, and he requested Professor Ray to speak. Well, what he spoke appeared in the next day's newspaper, and the write-up says he was a man of laboratory, but he felt that these are the occasions which demanded that he should leave his test tube to attend the call of the country. And there he gave this slogan: science can afford to wait, but Swaraj cannot. So this is that priority that he had set up. He's a successful scientist, but the Swaraj was the topmost priority for him. And this is something that we need to also imbibe into this time. In the North Bengal floods, most of the people in Calcutta know about it. Only thing what I will do is to report what appeared in Manchester Guardian in November 11, 1923. On the backdrop of North Bengal floods. In this circumstances, a professor of chemistry, Sir P.C. Ray, stepped forward and called upon his countrymen to make good the government's omission. He is a strong nationalist and a very strong critic of the government. He is a real organizer and a real teacher. I heard a European saying, if Mr. Gandhi had only been able to create 2 more Sir P.C. Ray, he would have succeeded in getting Swaraj within this year. This is the kind of personality that Professor Ray was. I spent some time on this particular work of Professor Ray, that is the history of Hindu chemistry. This is again a part of his nationalistic feeling. As we go along, we will know more about this. This is that book which he published. The volume 1 was published in 1992, and second volume came out in 1967. It's a monumental book on glorious achievement of ancient India in the field of chemical and medical sciences. He himself was an expert in Sanskrit language, and being an expert chemist, there cannot be any better combination to interpret the advances in chemical, medical, and metallurgical sciences in ancient India. Well, this particular book was received very warmly by several leading chemists like Berthelot, Arrhenius, and Lippmann. Of course, there is a story which is often told that Berthelot, when he met Professor Ray, he described to him his work on European chemistry. And there was a question that, was there anything like this in India? And Professor Ray took it very seriously. He went through all this literature in chemical sciences. And today when we discuss the ancient Indian science, the contributions, the first name we take is Professor Ray, because he rationally brought out everything. And whatever was superfluous, he had absolutely no qualms in saying that this did not exist, must have been added at a later stage. And this particular thing, we know today that India has a rich heritage of chemistry and metallurgy, starting from Indus Valley civilization to all these things. What we know, these are the largest metal structures, metal pillars in the world. This picture is from the Konark temple. And this is something which I'll spend little time towards the later stages. This is the one where the industrial level production of zinc was done in India. So this is what we know of today. And if you read his book, then this book covers the period of Vedic period till the 16th century. And we find that there was a remarkable progress in material science and metallurgy, including there was some idea about the atomistic basis of chemistry. but the techniques such as extraction, preparation, purification, characterization, applications of metals, alloys, chemical compounds, and all kinds of chemical processes such as calcination, sublimation, distillation, steaming, fixation, casting, and that too used for large-scale production was discussed. And he also identifies that in many of these endeavors, the ancient Indian chemists were far ahead of their counterparts elsewhere in the world. And we must thank Professor Acharya Praful Chandra Ray for bringing it to us. Now let me just give you a brief outlay. What is there in the history of Indian chemistry? I'm putting it in a diagrammatic manner. In that book, the chemistry development, chemistry and metallurgical development are divided into 5 periods. Vedic period up to 600 CE, then the Ayurvedic period up to 800 Common Era, then there is the transition period 800 to 1100, Tantric period is 1100 to 1300, and Iatrochemical period 1300 to 50 Common Era. Now, well, you can imagine what is the genesis of this verse. The Ayurvedic period, where the in structure of Ayurveda, the medicinal system was established. Then there was a transition period in which the metal-based medicines were introduced in India. So there was a transition. The Tantric period was a very, it's an important period, but it's a very strange times when the chemical sciences and Tantric practices, they got amalgamated. A lot of chemistry was done in the worship of Shiva and Parvati. And also in the Buddhist Tantra, they were done for the worship of Buddha. And then there are iatrochemical period where most of this chemical knowledge was used for public use. And this is what he identifies very clearly. And I'm not going to go through these slides. The Vedic period up to 600 BCE. Who are the chemists? Who are the authors? So you start from the Agnivesha. His book is manuscript is Agnivesha Tantra and Prashastapada. There is a book in Sanskrit, Padartha Dharma Sagra, the properties of matter. And then the Ayurvedic period, some of these names you know, Charaka, Shushruta, Kanada, Vakvata, Umaswati, Varaha, Mihira, so on and so forth. Then there is a transition period, Vrunda, Nagarjuna, Gangadhara, Chakrapani. Remember one thing that we have not been very careful in keeping our history. See, this Nagarjuna, whether he belongs to 2nd century AD or 8th century AD, we are not very clear. There are Nagarjunas, we find both sides. So this is one of the issues that we worry about. And then you can see here, earlier text, there were something like Artha Shastra, Yoga Sutra. They talked about a little bit of chemistry here and there. But then when you come to the Tantric period, you can see that every manuscript has that rasa added to the name. Like Vakvata Junior, Rasaratna Samachaya, Rasarnama. That is where the chemistry comes out as a distinct branch of intellectual activities. It basically starts from the transition period, Sarva Rasa Samagraha and all that. But later on, it's always this Sarveshwara Rasayana or Rasendra Chudamani, Rasa Chintamani, you can see. And later on in the iatrochemical period, practically every manuscript has that rasa there. Rasa Ratnakara, Rasa Raja Lakshmi, and so on and so forth. Rasa Pratipa, beautiful names. Also, I should connect here that in Sanskrit, rasa is also equivalently used for mercury. And therefore, some of these texts also talk about mercury reflections. There are so many other writings which Acharya Praful Chandra Ray talks about. However, they cannot be dated. For example, there is a text by Gorakshanatha, Goraksha Samhita and Raseshwara Siddhanta, where is the same Gorakshanatha some other, we do not know. And there are several chemists which are described in the text of several authors, but the corresponding texts are not available. And this is something which is extremely important, and we need to take a lesson from it. That we are not very kind to our history. We don't record, and I must tell you in the present context. See, during this corona pandemic, there was an idea floated that three of our oldest universities, Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras, earlier they have seen two pandemics, 1895 plague pandemic and 1920 the Spanish flu. And therefore, in their management council records or somewhere in the records, there must exist some material in which way this university, the education sector, handled the pandemic. And if we have some guidelines from there, then we can use those guidelines in 2020, 2021. Unfortunately, there is no record available. And this is what I say, that we are not very kind to our history. We do not keep our history. And these are the instances where that history becomes useful to find out what ways, if it was known that in 1920 the Spanish pandemic, the universities were closed, then that was one guideline. On the other hand, many of you know that Newton, his university was closed during the plague epidemic, and therefore he left university, and then he worked on his laws in gravitational, and all that great work what he did was during that period. So that is what is recorded, whereas in our case there are no records available. This is something we need to think about. And then he goes on to show what's in different periods of time, what was achieved. And you can see these are, most of the things are relating to the daily things what we keep using, and also the metal and all this work. I'll not go into the details. The important thing that we need to also understand, that whether there is a verse which provides something, is it true or not? That's an extremely important. And this is what we today say, is it scientifically validated? And for example, the Sushruta Samhita provides a verse for preparation of alkali. Well, English translation, and this English translation is like this: some well-grown trees in the forest are cut into logs and piled in a place from strong winds, free from strong winds. Limestone seashells should be placed on the piles and then set to fire by stalk of dry plants. When all the wood is burnt out and fire extinguished, ashes of the logs and burnt lime are collected and kept separate and dissolved in water. The extract of the ashes is then mixed with lime water to get the lye, which is separated from the precipitate by filtration. The solution is concentrated to different extent by boiling, and it is possible to get dilute, mild, and caustic alkali. This is all that verse says. Now, Professor Ray goes for the scientific validation. Now, there are lots of trees mentioned. So he puts his hand on Apamarga, a plant, and then he takes out the leaves, stem, roots, and makes ashes. And then you can see here, this is from his old records, which I have brought here in this font, red font. The Q2O, when you do the elemental analysis of ashes of leaves, stem, and root, what you find is in leaves, there is a 17.84% of K2O. In the stem, it is 32%, and in the root, 28.58%. Now, so this is a plant which has got a very high potassium content, so you get this potassium oxide. And then it is not strange that if you put potassium oxide in water, you should get potassium hydroxide, a strong alkali. So he tested, but look at also this, that the procedure which is listed there is different. It doesn't say that you make potassium oxide and dissolve it in water. There is a role of seashells there. So that entire chemical reaction is something like this. You have the seashells, the calcium carbonate decomposes, gives a calcium carbonate and carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide reacts with potassium oxide, giving the potassium carbonate. And now these two different ashes put in the water and then mix. Then what you will have is potassium carbonate plus calcium hydroxide. Will give you potassium hydroxide and calcium carbonate, which is that precipitate which is filtered. So this is, he also went through the text on preparation of calomel. He was interested in the chemistry of mercury, and therefore this was his pastime activities, one should say. This is a G2Cl2. There is a procedure given, and then he validates this, that you take the purified mercury, take ferric oxide, alum, rock salt, and all that, and the white camphor-like solid is your rasakarpura. In the ancient text, there are lots of chemical apparatuses are described, and Professor Ray drew the sketches of this chemical apparatus. That is, what is the Teki Yantram, what is intended. Most important is the Tiryukapatra Yantram, that is the downward distillation process, which were invented in India sometime in 200 BC. So that is what he keeps recording, that this is what existed then. And I'll spend little time. I mean, this is where we should also celebrate the achievements of ancient Indian chemists and metallurgists. Following Professor Ray's work, a lot of activities have happened now in deciphering the chemistry and metallurgy. Yeah, lots of archaeologists and historians are involved in it. So I'll just bring two cases at what stage of understanding we are. The first one is about the procedure for zinc extraction. The text, which is Rasaratna Samachaya, depicts it. And there are some lines which I have underlined for some understanding of chemistry. What it says is that you take that ore of zinc, which is called kharpara. Kharpara is calamine. And then you mix it with lots of turmeric resins. And these are basically the reducing agents. And then it says musham mushopari tasya karparam pratameda tata. That is, you put it in a pot and cover the crucible with another pot. So since you close it, and then it says kharpare prajvalate jwala. When you lit this particular thing, the flame will turn from blue to white. And when it turns white, you'll be sure that your product zinc is ready. Now that's pretty interesting, because this particular work is done with a very low oxygen pressure, and therefore initially you will find the formation of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and that carbon monoxide will burn with a blue flame. This is today's knowledge, but this is an observation. And when that whole carbon dioxide is consumed in the reduction process, now you will get a white flame. The way Neela is a blue flame, Sita, it becomes white, and that is where the product is ready. So these details are available. And in 1983, the Zawar mines, a lot of work was done there by the international team. This is reported in the Cadoc's article Endeavor of 1987. They found these zinc mines, which are dated 2000 to 2500 years ago, and there were zinc smelting furnaces also were excavated. So this is where the large-scale production used to happen. And some of the construction is like this. You can see it here, this inverted crucibles here. These are basically the retards made up of earth. And this is where the charge is put along with the fissing agents, and they're arranged like this, 6 by 6 matrix, and that is what you can see here. You can see here, these are those 6 by 6 arrangements. And then this reduction was done in the low oxygen pressure, and then you collect molten zinc here. This is a downward distillation. And using today's knowledge, the operating conditions and capacities, there are estimates made. The temperature was around 1100 to 1200 degrees centigrade. It was a low oxygen partial pressure. Typical operation time was 5 hours. And this 36 retards would give you something like 7 to 8 kgs per batch. So each retard would give you around 200 to 500. And along this, around these mines, there was a debris of 6 lakh tons of spent retards. And if you back calculate and date also those retards, it appears that 1 lakh ton of zinc was produced in 5 centuries. It's a phenomenally large production in the medieval time. And this was done at Zawar. And I should also give you a little bit of a history. Some part of it is covered by Professor Ray. I'll add the recent developments. Zinc mining, there are archaeological evidences around 700 BC. The brass objects of Takshashila and Gangetic plains containing greater than 33% of zinc. This gives an evidence that the zinc must have been separated. The reason is there is a simpler way of making brass, that is, you take copper and heat it along with the zinc ore, so that whatever nascent zinc is produced, it gets into the copper. But that copper, that brass does not have that bright shine. If you want to make any brass which is greater than 25% of zinc, you necessarily need to get elemental zinc, the zinc metal, and mix it with copper. Archaeologists say that anything greater than 33%. This people did know about the zinc separation. Well, zinc was taken to China. It was documented later by Nagarjuna. Whatever Zawar mines which I have shown, these were around 880, and they were expanded to large-scale production by 12th century. Now, independently in South India, there was some zinc extraction done in the pillar. Now, these are the two important ones. In 1500 AD, the Portuguese took the Indian zinc technology to China. And in 1740, until 1740, Europe did not have any zinc production. So William Champion, he established zinc smelting at Bristol. And his process was downward distillation method. It's said that it is inspired by the Zawar process. In fact, William Champion's patent was rejected twice on this basis, that it is just a copy of what is done at Zawar, but later on he got a patent, and that was established in 1740. There's also some interesting anecdotes that in 1500 AD, the Portuguese took Indian zinc technology to China, and Chinese started exporting zinc, and they exported zinc with the name Totamo or Tutena, which is derived from Tathanaga. That is the word used for zinc in South India. That's a Sanskritized word. Tathanaga is. Another one is about the India's mastery over iron technology, and Professor P.C. talks about it. Historical evidences are King Guru presents steel to Alexander. Arab Idris in 12th century said the Hindus excel in manufacture of iron. It is possible to find anything to surpass the age of an Indian steel. James Ferguson in 1897 in the History of Indian Architecture talks about it. Hindus at that time were capable of forging a bar of iron larger than that forged anywhere in Europe up to very late and not frequently. Damascus sword, which was used during these crusades and earlier, it was made from Indian steel. So Indians used to export steel to Damascus, Syria, and they used to make special steels, and they were very famous for that. And the Damascus forts were made up of special Indian steel, the wood steel. This is one sample, some photograph of the wood steel. Now, there are several other cross references. The Damascus forts showed the large amounts of carbon nanotubes just to connect it with it. Well, the ancient Indians did not know about it. Let's be honest. And therefore, Robert Kerr, the Nobel laureate in chemistry, made a statement. The carbon nanotechnology was much older than carbon nanoscience. For the Damascus fort, Indians produced the raw material, mined iron ore and exported it. Up to the middle of 18th century, the steel swords depended on this particular material. And when the mines in India stopped, that was because of the British rules, they lost the technology. Should also give you history of the wood steel. The wood steel was an advanced material of the ancient world. It's a steel with the uniform composition of 1 to 1.6% of carbon. And this is the material which was used for the best quality swords. The process originated in South India, 500 BC. There are writings, Greek writings, and also the carbon dating of the crucibles. In 200 BC, it was adopted in Sri Lanka. In 600 to 1700 AD, this material was exported to the Arab world and also Europe for making this Damascus sword. And this is mentioned by the Arab historians, scholars like Hamza, Jabir ibn Hayyar, Al-Biruni, and so on and so forth. The interesting part starts after 1700. The Westerners start taking interest, and Benjamin Hans is a German botanist who was visiting South India. He came across this process in South Indian villages, and in the Kannadigas call this material as ukku, and therefore he named it as woods. So the origin of the word is also from South Indian language. The Royal Society of Chemistry attempted to analyze the composition, and in fact, Michael Faraday, he thought that he can make a wood steel by mixing so many things. He made several alloys, but who could never reproduce. Then there is an interesting thing about this is about the microstructures. When the high resolution instruments were available, wood was the first material that was studied for the microstructures by the scientists from UK, France, Russia, US. And somewhere around 1950, the woods was made in modern technology. So we have lost one more thing. Well, this thing we need to also put it in the perspective. And that is where I will come to the last 5 minutes of this presentation. And this is the question which Professor Ray asked, and this is a very honest question. We had such a great scientific tradition. He covers the period up to 16th century. Why did we lose this? This is an important question. And he provides, I mean, there's a painstakingly he keeps writing about it. And there are several things which he talks about. We lost the, see, after this Nalanda was destroyed, we lost the formal education system in this country. So the skills were remained confining to the families, caste, subcaste, and the knowledge got fragmented. You can imagine this in the 4th century AD. Indians across the country were producing steel in the same manner. So there was some way of communicating even those times. But that somehow things were lost, and there was a decline of scientific spirit in them. And which Acharya Ray says that this country is naturally prone to metaphysical subtleties. We are interested more in abstraction. We are interested in dharma, artha, moksha, and all that. You know, the abstract ideas. We generally not tend to discuss what is required from the society and how we can produce and make become. And so the metaphysical ideas rooted in our civilization. There are, of course, other reasons we know about it. The one which is important is it starts with the Battle of Plassey, where the colonization of India started in 1757. And then around the same time, the Industrial Revolution took place in Europe, and the discovery of steam engine and its application to products and transport, it changed the whole scenario. And that scenario, you could produce in large quantities in short times, and our handicrafts, our way of doing it with the hands, just could not compete, howsoever the best material. And also 1835, the English Education Act, which promoted the clerks and the munsips in this country. So this is what together it stopped us. And what do we learn from here? We learn from here in the today's context is the achievements of chemistry and metallurgy of ancient India provides us the backdrop of reigniting that entrepreneurial spirit, which made India prosperous in the distant past. We talk about India as a originator of philosophies and ideas, but hardly any time we discuss this that India was rich. It was a prosperous country, and why was it? And those roots of that prosperity was in the entrepreneurial spirit, a spirit which we lost after the English Education Act. India was workshop of the world, and this workshop of the world, we have gifted merrily to China. And we need to repeat the success story yet again. And that is what Professor Ray says. The Indian nation, with its glorious past and vast talent potentialities, may yet look forward to a still glorious future. And if the perusal of these pages, I have discussed a part of this, will have the effect of stimulating my countrymen to strive to regain their old position in the intellectual hierarchy of nation, I shall not have labored in vain. That's the message that we take from this work on history of chemistry. Conclude, well, such a giant personality, a defining personality in the freedom movement. Contrary, I'll just bring words of a great leader, and that is Rajendra Prasad. He wrote, Acharya Ray revived and handed on the flame the pursuit of truth, which once burned so brightly. See, we had a discontinuity. 16th century onwards till 19th century, we had that discontinuity in the scientific pursuit. And this is what Rajendra Prasad refers to, that he breached it, he revived that ancient tradition of the pursuit of truth, and which once burned so brightly in India. And he has left behind an example of service and sacrifice for his countrymen to follow for the fulfillment and enrichment of their lives. That was said by Rajendra Prasad. With this, I'll end this presentation. And well, I have collected materials from many sources. The most important one is the life and experiences of the Bengali chemist Praful Chandra Ray himself. And well, I was just as a matter of details, I was trying to look at the publisher, find very interesting spelling of Chakravarti. And then in Acharya Praful Chandra Ray's History of Hindu Chemistry, Volume 1 and Volume 2. And A.K. Biswas has done voluminous work on chemistry methodology in India, and the Craddock is the details about that international work on the Savar mines. With this, I thank you, and if you have any comments, well, we can discuss. discuss.
Thank you, Jaka, for this very wonderful and brilliant depiction of life and work of this extremely great man, as you said. And you started your seminar by saying that it's a demanding job to talk about Professor Ray in Bengal or in Calcutta. But I think you have covered so many aspects and lives of Professor Ray. I'm sure, at least myself, I was not aware of many of the aspects that you have covered and many details that you have provided with, I mean, especially with the steel industry and all these details I think are, at least was very fascinating for me. And I'm sure there will be questions. So may I request the audience to raise your hand so that we can take question one by one? Yes, Professor Pal, he has a question.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Sir, thank you very much, for the very enlightening talk. I'm always excited about your talk. Last time you gave a talk in Sanskrit even, in Bigyan Prashad. So this is like, sir, I have several questions, but for the interest of the time, I'm not going because we work on the ghee dalda problem also spectroscopically. And we found that not only British cow and Indian cow, if you consider that region to region, there is a huge variation of the ghee from the cow. So that we found, and so as APC also did something. So I will not go. I will also not go about this mercurous nitrite, which is really controversy. But people started working as a coramine, like a for a respiratory stimulant. So that thing I wanted to have your comment, but not right now. But sir, one thing that I like to ask you and want to have your comment, that what the LLC, like a limited liability company that APC started in 1908, that became a state-owned company because it was a sick industry something. And if you visit, sir, right now, like 3 years back, it happened that I visited the Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceuticals inside, and I had a chance to discuss with the directors, and they were not happy about the APC's vision of the resignation from the board of directors. And he clearly said, as you mentioned, that he was against about the high dividend and profit making kind of stuff. So sir, my point is that so far sustainability of a company is concerned, how come a board of directors can avoid the dividend distribution and the like in terms of some incentive? So that I need to have your comment. But is it the root cause? That's why Bengal Chemicals is still a sick industry right now.
There are a few other observations, but let me stick to what you are asking. See, company does not become sick just like that. The people who make the company sick. See, there are visions of the people. Just to tell you this contrast. In 1890, Professor Ray talks about educating the next generation in Bengali. Let's say. Let's take that as an example. In 1920, he also includes it in his convocations. Now, this is where we need to think. See, he has his vision. Now, in 1890, he is talking after about 55 years of the English Education Act. The English education was started in 1885, and in 1890, he thinks that, well, this education cannot reach to the interior part of this country, it cannot reach it will remain remain only in the cities unless it is promoted by through the mother tongue. Perfectly right. I mean, there are no two opinions about it. Now I am taking that statement in 2020. In 2020, I need to factor that how many years the English education is available to this country? More than 150 years. Now, is that statement still correct? See, how do I implement it? See, this contextuality of anything has to be tested. Even, see, this is what happens if you do not read, I mean, this is what largely happens in India. See, history is trying to study the present using the knowledge of the past. Some of that knowledge is still going to be interesting, important. Some of the knowledge might have become absolute, but let's test it. So I will not comment on what on the discussion that you had on Bengal Chemicals and Pharmaceutical Works, but importantly, in 1898, when somebody starts a company, there is some vision he has. There are certain chemicals he has in his mind, and as time progresses, that basket has to be expanded. You can't remain with the same set of chemicals and say that I'm still going to make a profit. It is not possible. And for that, newer knowledge has to come into the industry. Either the industry, that particular industry, should have its own R&D. If they do not have, look, West Bengal has such a great chemistry tradition in the university. They can go to the universities and say that, look, this is what we want to synthesize, this is what we want to get. Can you help? If they don't do it, then this is what it is. So we cannot blame it on the vision of Professor Ray. Certainly not. And you mentioned about nitrous oxide, that is, right?
Right, sir.
NO is, see, even during Corona pandemic, people were talking about inhaling NO. See, NO is a very wonderful molecule. And there is also one product my team has done on nitrous oxide, which is used for wound healing even in the diabetic wounds. It has got lots of healing properties.
Sir, I was talking about mercurous nitrite. So that people started working as a coramine, like before the death. Earlier, physicians usually used to inject it.
Yeah, there are also lots of reports on say whether mercury can be used as mercurous chloride, the calomel, the medicine or not. We need to go through that debate first. And it's a long debate. It will take you in the Ayurvedic formulations. But you see, people have been using that as a medicine. One of the examples is Dalai Lama. His hair contains mercury more than the permissible limit he takes it. But see, these are certain practices which we do not know completely. This is what I would say. Again, there you need a person like Professor Ray who will do the scientific validation and say that this is good or not.
Okay, thank you. Any other question from the audience? Anybody else wants to ask a question?
Hello.
Yes, please.
I'm Gautam Dev. I have one query actually to Professor Jagatav. That you have your talk was excellent about Professor A.P.C. Ray's work, you have covered many aspects about his work. I have one small query actually. He established so many industries about maybe hundreds of years ago.
Yes,
Ah,
yes.
so, you know that unfortunately we could not make any industrial revolution, and we could not make any industrial success now. And you know that for a tiny chemical, we have to import all these things. So, what is your comment about why we could not able to motivate our young students or young colleagues? Why they are not? Why they are always after publications? Why they are? Why we are unable to motivate them? Actually, could you make any comment?
I have been also talking about this in various fora. Good that you asked this question. Is it going online?
Yeah, yeah.
It is.
Okay.
Yes, I am online because I have in front of my house lots of water, so I could not.
You, to see the history of science in modern India. Okay. Well, it begins with all this, and then you have the academic entrepreneurs and so on and so forth. During their time, they excite other academic entrepreneurs, and this is what the story began. What happens after Second World War that also we need to take into. Okay, I'll give you a little historical background and how it influences us. See, the Second World War ended with there is a famous statement now. The physicists won the Second World War with the microwave radar and ended it with the nuclear bomb. Okay, this was basically a war which involved a lot of science.
Yeah.
After Second World War, immediately after the Cold War began. Now that's an important period for education all over the world. I should tell you, not only in India. The Americans wanted to have the supremacies in science and technology, and therefore the universities were funded through the military for work on various kinds of works which is ultimately related to the war efforts. Well, the Los Alamos laboratory was for making nuclear weapons. See, you got to see this. And the university faculty and the students were involved in this. So this is what, there are famous articles like Cold War and hot physics. You know, during that Cold War, a lot of hot physics came. That hot physics came also in India. However, the Americans realized that hot physics does not give jobs. So they made a change somewhere around 1990 or so in their thing. We have not made a change. We still continue.
Yeah.
That is one thing. Second thing is after independence, you see we needed our universities to make a pitch for this entrepreneurship and startups. We were so late in the scientific community, like in the United States, if I give an example, on one hand they will salute Einstein, on the other hand they will salute Steve Jobs. Both are important for them. Whereas in the Indian context, we make only Einstein as the hero. We don't have a Steve Jobs. Whereas that society understands the importance of economy, so for them, Steve Jobs is an example for the younger generation. We never did that. And the third thing, the important thing is this goes by John Davies said something in 1950s, which was adopted in the American education system. He did not do it. He said that whatever is taught in the school is not related to what the student experiences in his interaction with the world. And whatever he experiences, his gains with his interaction in the world, he cannot find out those solutions in the class. So what is this? The isolation of school and the society. Other than the things, they said, look, now we need to change the science education. How did they change that? That's also important. See, there is a content of science. oh, I need to teach Newton's laws, I need to teach relativity, I need to teach this, fine. But this is a one-dimensional approach. Now, what they did, they started the second axis, context, provide the context. If you read Newton's laws, the teacher must provide the context. This is where you can use it. This is where it is used. The relevance of science in the development of the society has to be taught within the curriculum framework. This is what Americans started doing in 70s, 60s and 70s, and that has given them a bit. We have not done it. See, I keep visiting visits of the students from universities or emails. There was an awkward question once I got. Sir, I asked my teacher why for I should learn quantum mechanics, and my teacher has no answer. So can you tell me why I should learn quantum mechanics? That's a wonderful thing that is happening in the country. Without a context, we are giving a content. If we do that, see, if you watch on some videos, there are interesting videos. Sorry, I'll elaborate. Banana has a lot of potassium, 300 milligrams per kg or something like that. So I watched one video. Can you extract potassium from bananas? You see, very interesting idea. I think these are the kind of problems we should pose to our students. There's no point in just telling chemistry of sodium, alkalis and all that. And then that video talks about ashing it and then making that, and then it will have some calcium oxides dissolved. It will get a calcium hydroxide, potassium hydroxide. Now, how do you separate potassium? Now, it's a school laboratory. If you want to do, don't do electrolysis, then they put some, what is that? Sodium perchlorate. The potassium perchlorate is insoluble. So that settles down. See, these are the actual practical experiences we have. Then only our students can. Otherwise, if you just tell them, oh, there is a chemistry of potassium, there is a chemistry of alkaline earths, nothing is going to happen. There is a quantum physics, so they will take it as a mathematical exercise, solve something, and end up. Context has to.
So we have to change our education policies.
No, this is content in the education policy. See, I keep doing some social work on this. I'll tell you one interesting example. New policy says that the critical thinking and problem solving abilities have to be generated during the high school time. I mean school. Now, this does not mean that you have an extra lecture on critical thinking. Somebody will come and give a lecture on critical thinking. Somebody will give a lecture on entrepreneurial spirit. No. It has to be contained within what you are teaching. So, one teacher asked me, sir, this is again abstract. How do you do that? So, I constructed one example, which I keep using these days for last 1 year. See, you ask a question to the students. Now, all that we have learned, this can be asked at a 7th, 8th standard. But if you ask this question to an engineer, he will not be in a position to solve this problem. That also I can tell. Suppose you have got a drum. Okay, it's a cylinder, and there is an oil in it, and you want to lift it by crane. And that drum does not have a hook. So how do you do this? Now, can you construct something by which I can lift it by a hook? Okay. Now you see the critical thinking and problem solving. This is a problem I have. I have a drum which I'm going to fill in the oil there. I'm going to lift it, but it does not have a hook. What do I do? Where do I fix that hook? Now you see, this is the question. Now, the hook has to be fixed. If you take the top circle at the center of it, then you can lift it without spilling the oil. Now you have got a circle. How do you find its center? That's the critical thing. And problem solving ability. Now that requires simply a geometric construction. So given a circle, how do I find the center of the circle? You have asked the problem in a reverse manner. All problems have to be solved in the reverse manner, no, not in the direct manner. How do you do that? Now, to tell student that, look, I'm going to use something which you have learned in the 7th standard geometry. You have learned that angle in a half circle is a right angle triangle. Right? Angle in a half circle is a right angle. So I'll put one chord, and the second chord I'll draw at 90. Then they will cut the circle at 2 points. I join these 2 points. This is my half circle, so this is my diameter. Then I measure the center of this, and that is my center. So I will take that round, pick up the center there, fix the hook there, and get it. See, all practical problems require this transformation. That what is that problem, what principle I should use, and how do I go about doing it? We never teach this. We have told our students angle in a half circle is right angle. They have done rote learning. So, and if you give some problem, can they apply it? So this has to happen within the class.
Yeah.
That if you can do, you can generate students who will apply knowledge, the needs of the society, and also they will become rich. But we can discuss these issues at some other point in a big way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any other question? I see Professor Paul has raised hand again. But before we come back to him, is there any other question? Well, I don't find anyone from the audience. So Professor Paul, please go ahead.
Sir, I cannot resist myself, from asking another question. As there is no. Sir, as a policy making committee of a national education policy making committee, I know that you are a member of that, and also you are associated with several research institute, like a governing body and all the advisory body. Sir, do you see any hope in coming 20 years, for example, that the bridge between science and the entrepreneurship in my country will be made, or the gap that we made already between science and the entrepreneurship will be closed eventually? So last question, sir. I will not raise my hand anymore.
That's a good question, I must say, because I'm pretty hopeful. Number one is I'm very hopeful that things are happening, maybe at a slow rate. If you look at the kind of new startups in the country, okay, I mean, you see the ecosystem. Well, there are startups which are largely related to AI, ML, and or e-commerce and things like that. That's one. There are a large number of startups coming in the agricultural sector. The IIT students, they go for startups in agriculture. If you also see that there are startups coming in the field of traditional Indian art, traditional Indian knowledge. So I'll put that farming and traditional Indian knowledge as one basket. Okay. Now you see that provides an interesting perspective to discuss the question that you have. And also it relates to the earlier discussion we had. See, with the kind of modern science we are learning and we are practicing in our laboratories and institutes, we have not given any input to the traditional Indian knowledge. We have not done anything. We only say that terracotta is a great thing, and in Bengal we'll find good terracotta. But can I introduce something by which I can make the process efficient? I can make it with a less cost. Can I worry about the raw material? Ultimately, the worker or the artisan gets more money out of it. I'll extract some money anyway as a scientist. Do that. We have not intercepted in this material. You will be surprised. Ashwagandha is what we talk day in, day out. Today, you cannot work on medicinal chemistry of ashwagandha because ashwagandha is patented by Japanese. Why did it happen? We ignored. We said, oh, this is all humbug, that ashwagandha and all that. Then someone like me and you who is in a small university, I want to get some academic credit. The academic credit is foreign trade, foreign collaboration. So I start developing foreign collaboration with the university abroad and use that conduit to transfer my traditional knowledge there. Ultimately, it ends up in patent in that country. I don't get anything. I get some academic credit because of the things around it. How many things are we going to lose? That's one area where, and IIT students are very clever. They have started doing this startups in agricultural sector, hydroponic and this farming, that farming, then all kinds of things, and they're making more money. In Rajasthan, the university students have started a startup in terracotta, and they claim that they have increased the income of the workers by 40%. They give some market strategy and all that, online and this and that, which whole thing works. We have not done that. That's very unfortunate, and that is where I've been sensitizing many groups that why not we do this? This may be good idea. The second reflection from this is that for business you require new knowledge. We are not creating new knowledge for business, and therefore our youngsters are taking the traditional knowledge and trying to make a business out of it. We are not giving them new knowledge to start business. These are the things which the intellectual community of this country must discuss. See, this cannot be, it is simply not, the policies are there in place, but value of a policy is going to be dependent on how you are going to implement it. You see, there was a call, oh, we should have patents. So we started filing patents even from the institutes and universities. But then, how many of them are getting commercialized or anything they are patenting? We need to ask this question. The implementation of a policy is extremely important. How do we view that? See, many places we are spending money to retain those patent rights, whereas the patents are not commercialized. So what is it happening? So that is what we need to discuss. Also inform our students, where are your opportunities? Where are your opportunities today? The PC Ray set up an example and he said that, look, don't go for the government service or multinational company, start a business. There is a huge description, he keeps discussing the Marwadis in Bengal, how they are rich, what do they do, have they got university education? No. Does it mean that university education disqualifies you for business? You see, there are several questions he gets. This is what we need to keep asking. Today you see the whole technology, entrepreneurship is technology related. And therefore, we need to take it to the students.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have one question which is probably more of.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for detailing this thing and tolerating me for longer time. Thank you, sir.
I have a scientific question regarding the steel that we discussed, which was used for this Damascus. So this is a certain concentration of carbon that was used.
Yeah.
Of course, all steel material has certain fraction of carbon, but this is a very specific concentration. So you mentioned of some nanotechnology. So the carbon with this kind of concentration, does it make some nano structures inside the steel? Has it been kind of
No.
probed about, or?
What the reported things as Carl says that the Damascus ores were examined and they have some amount of carbon nanotubes. So it could be their strength and all that could be related.
Yes.
That's one. Basically, it's wood steel, which will have about 1.6% carbon. Now, this is all what we know. I mean, the further studies are required. But interestingly, we have lost that technology.
Yes.
However, there's some description which is available. So what they used to do was take iron, make iron, they reduce your and wrap it up with some beads and keep it hot. So that is allow for certain carbon to diffuse in it. And then after a week they used to condition it. There was some spray procedure which they were using. There is also mentioned that they had some wooden boxes made up of a particular wood. They pour iron and keep it for some days. And then you get that. So now this process needs to be now redone. What was really happening and why that particular bead or why that particular wood, we do not know. But this is essentially lost. At the same time, amount that each batch was just enough for making a couple of swords. The amount was not very high.
But it has a spatial
Yes.
texture,
Yes.
as well as
There are
strength
various
and
things, yes.
there are so much of work
And
still in that.
all this was developed using, and this is the empirical knowledge. They just didn't have any
Yes.
microscopes
Yes.
or anything. That's interesting.
So let's thank Professor Jagtap once again for this brilliant talk.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sure, you can attend more questions over email or.
Oh, yeah.
It's
That's fine.
always accessible.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.